Welcome guys to the next installment of the Bearded Watchmaker. This episode is the second part of the Wreck to Rest series. In the first episode, I took apart a junk watch that was destined for the dustbin. After taking it apart, we identified all the damaged components and then cleaned up whatever we could save. In this episode, we will turn it into something that anyone would be proud to wear. We start off by putting the main top plate together, and first we need to clean the die shock cap jewels. I'll also show you how to manually oil these, but to be honest, ideally you'd want to be using an automatic oiler as it's much easier and saves a lot of time. As you'll no doubt see, this is an incredibly finicky process. It's pretty difficult to place that cap jewel back in such a way that you don't smear the oil you just applied all over the place when trying to put the shock spring back. It usually takes me a few tries to do this properly, hence going for an auto oiler, if only to cut down on the amount of swearing that ensues. And yes, swearing is another hobby of mine. For those of you that seen my previous SKX repair video, you'll notice that the Seiko movement is very similar to the one I repaired there. There are some slight differences between the 7S26 movement in the SKX and the 7S36 movement I'm working on here. In fact, there were more differences than I thought. More on that later. The last part of prepping before assembly is getting the mainspring back together. As I've mentioned in another video, the Seiko mainsprings aren't really supposed to be taken apart. But in the spirit of DIY, I say, have at it. You do, however, need a mainspring winder in order to do it without the risk of damaging the spring itself. I've really tried doing it manually, but as with the auto oiler mentioned earlier, there's just some areas of watchmaking where you have to bite the bullet and pay through your nose to get the correct equipment. Now for the fun part, and that's tackling the horribly rotten hands. I'll first need to remove the old blackened loom and then see what I can do about the tarnishing on the hands. As mentioned before, I'm not into gold, so I'm not really too attached to these hands, to be honest. I'll be doing a little experimenting on these to see if I can buff them up a little. Bearing in mind it's very easy for the gold plating to come off if you go too crazy. I generally learn by screwing things up, so I fully expect this to be a disaster. Using some leather didn't reel too much, so I grabbed the never dull and that managed to do the trick. With a little practice, I got all the tarnishing off the hands and it came out surprisingly well, as you'll see here. They're by no means perfect, as some of the tarnishing has affected a small spot on the hour hand, but they're perfectly usable nonetheless. Just look at the shine on that second's hand. Seeing as I've managed to get the hands to look presentable, I'll have to relume them now again. There are many cheap kits available to do this, but honestly, I've had the most consistent results using the Bajan kits. Of course they're overpriced, it's Swiss after all. But you can do many reluming jobs with a kit like this and I'm okay with that. I still have a pile of watches here for future content, so it made it perfectly worthwhile for me. The loom comes in a powder form and you mix it in an epoxy-like fluid. Getting the consistency right is critical though. This is basically what you're after. Outside of that, the process couldn't be simpler. I suspend the hands using these balance spring spikes, making sure to place them upside down. If you got your consistency right, it really is as simple as scooping the mixture up using a small oiler and just dragging it over the hands. Obviously being careful not to spill any over the sides of the hands. Sometimes you're lucky and you cover the hand in one go. Other times you may need a few passes. With the consistency the way it is, it'll fill the opening evenly using capillary action of the mixture to settle evenly when dry. Here with the hour hand it went nicely with just one go. And there, the loom on both hands filled out nicely and even. Time to put these away for a day to allow the loom to cure. While the loom cures, let's start putting the nearly clean parts of the movement together and, as usual for this movement, we start with the keyless works. Now the term keyless works comes from the old pocket watch days, where you didn't have a crown to wind the watch but a key that you inserted into the movement to wind it. Around 100 years ago, people figured out it's a pain to keep a key around to wind the watch, so watchmakers started using crowns to wind the watch and hence, keyless. It sometimes boggles the mind why such archaic terms still persist till this day, but some things in horology just seem to stick. Personally, I prefer winding works as that seems more appropriate, but hey, I'm just an amateur, what do I know? For most keyless works or winding works, I use a grease. This is typically used where there's high torque metal-to-metal parts interacting with each other. It helps smoothen the operation of the crown and prevents wear over the long term. Earlier I mentioned the difference between the 7S26 and the latest 7S36 movements, and here's the first one. On the older movement, the escape wheel and the third wheel had normal jewels on the main plate. On this newer movement there's a cap wheel bridge, which I'm fitting now, and because of this, the escape wheel and third wheel isn't backwards compatible to the older movement. Yet another difference is the center wheel, the one I'm fitting here, which I didn't realize at the time would be an issue. I got the whole motion works together, testing everything as I went along, until I mounted the main plate where things got unraveled. Once the main plate was secured, the whole train seemed to be stuck, and it turned out that the pivot of the newer center wheel is smaller, so there was too much play between it and its jewel, causing enough side-to-side shake of the center wheel and the movement work ceasing in the process. It took me a while to figure that out. I guess you live and learn, huh? Now, with most of the movement works installed, it's time to fit the top plate. Again. And this time the train runs smoothly, as it should. I've mentioned this before, but this hobby really teaches you patience. You have to be careful when putting things together, especially if you've replaced a bunch of parts. It can be extremely frustrating when things don't work like it should, but on the other hand, it keeps things interesting and you learn from every mistake. I'll oil the mainspring barrel and seconds wheel pivot on the movement side, then flip the movement over to oil the other side of the mainspring barrel and the AutoWorks reduction pivot. With that done, we can fit the ratchet wheel and get it tightened down. Up next is fitting the pallet fork bridge. Again, this can be fiddly and you want to take your time to get it just right so as not to damage any of the pivots. These pivots and their jewels should not be oiled, but you want to spend extra time here to make sure they're very clean at the prep stage. Let's get some wine onto that mainspring so that we can test that the motion works operates correctly. I'll also add a specific grease to the exit stone of the pallet fork and then manually operate the pallet fork to both lubricate all the teeth on the escape wheel and to make sure that the pallet fork ticks smartly in both directions. Remember what the old balance spring looked like? It was pretty rusty, and to be quite honest, it's way too critical to the operation of the watch to take any chances trying to save it. These springs are so ridiculously delicate that most attempts to mess with them just ends in tears. Easiest here would be to rather replace it with a brand new one. As you can guess, it's a pretty delicate thing to do, but the Seiko datasheet has a detailed breakdown of how this should be done. Basically, you remove the old balance spring from the balance bridge, install the new balance spring in position, and then mount the balance bridge back again, making sure the balance spring pivots line up correctly to the top and bottom. You then gently take the loose stud on the new mainspring and carefully insert it back into the stud support of the balance bridge. This is a press fit, so take stout tweezers to gently insert the stud into the stud support until it's fully in place. Last step is to gently, and I seem to be using that word a lot here, manipulate the spring into the opening of the regulator stud. If you got this far without rigging the balance spring, you can twist the regulator stud in an anti-clockwise direction to get the stud gap just right. You can fine-tune this gap once the balance spring is spinning by eye. You don't want the spring to slap between the gap as the balance spring is spinning. You want the gap to be small enough to very lightly hold the spring in place. Now we remove the die-shock jewels in order to clean them. I've shown this process before on the AutoWorks train jewels, but I just can't help myself. This was one of the most challenging things I've had to learn when I started out, so just let me brag a little bit here. The cap jewels on the die shocks were pretty dirty in this case. Usually a quick clean in one dip sorts them out, but I had to go ham with a pegwood here to get all the gummed up old oil completely removed. I add the perfect amount of thin oil onto the cap jewel and can then install it back into the balance setting, followed by getting that infernal shock spring fitted correctly again. Let's just get that plastic spacer ring installed, and then we can get into assembling the parts on the dial side. My plan was to use the original day-date discs, but somehow the original date disc was for a 4 o'clock crown, not a 3 o'clock crown as I need here. This was pretty strange because the original case had a 3 o'clock crown. I've pretty much given up trying to figure out how all this happened and made peace with the fact that the watch was certainly messed with before I got it. I wouldn't be surprised if someone just chucked some random parts into it at some point. Who knows? As a matter of interest, I tried figuring out what the original watch case was used for, and I found similar shaped cases, but never one that was in gold. This does seem to be a mystery watch after all. In any case, I ended up stripping the day and date wheel disc from another newer donor movement, which turned out to be in much better condition anyway. We're in the home stretch finishing off this movement. We just need to do a quick test to make sure that the calendar functions all work correctly. Last item for the movement is installing the AutoWorks rotor and we're done. I've recently created an Instagram page for the channel. You're welcome to join me there, where I'll be posting many more pics and snippets of stuff that didn't make it into the video. I also like posting pics of upcoming projects, and I'd love some input on the direction some of these projects could take. Anyway, just look at that dial. It cleaned up pretty nicely and I couldn't be happier. I'm also just as happy with the way that the polish and loom job on the hands came out in the end. When I started this project, I was pretty much torn on if the dial and hands would be usable. Granted, they're by no means immaculate, but considering the state that they were in, they're certainly perfect for this project. Now that the movement is pretty much assembled, I'm getting done installing all the hands, taking care to make sure that they are perfectly seated so they don't interfere with each other as they move. I also want to do a final check to make sure that the date change happens when the hour and minute hands are at the 12 o'clock position. And the moment of truth. Was all of that work worth it? The time graph seems to think so, thank goodness. Both the rate and the beat area is looking pretty good, showing a nice clear trace without any weird dots that may indicate an issue with the new balance spring that I installed. The amplitude is maybe slightly low at 230-ish degrees, but it's certainly still reasonable for a typical Seiko movement, and let's be honest, it's a massive improvement on a watch that was seized up from rust. I can certainly live with it. Because it's been a while since I posted the first video, let's just have a look at where we started and how it all turned out. Thank you so much for joining me in this rebuild video. I genuinely appreciate the time you took watching it. Stay tuned for the next project soon, as there'll be more raising watches from the dead. Take care.